All right, good afternoon. How are you guys doing today? All right, I am going to make an assumption, given that response, that all of you had a nice heavy dose of rice with your lunch and then went up to your hotel room and carb loaded some more. So to warn you now, I am going to make you do things. Terrible, awful, evil things like raise your hand. So I want you to be prepared, all right? So this is lessons learned from NAIC's peer review. I'm going to be talking about things that we've learned over the past really almost 2 years, given how the timing has worked out from the most recent peer reviews back. That'll include analysis and exam. So what will we be doing? We'll be talking about what we figured out for analysis best practices first, then exam best practices, a few other lessons learned, things that came out of this that aren't necessarily best practices, but reminders, things we figured out, and then a little bit of advertising for things coming up. I am already on slide 2 going to be moving off script. So if we're going to be talking about peer review, we should probably talk about what peer review is, or at least what does that mean in the NAIC context. So what we do is we invite people to apply, and we bring in analysts and/or examiners, depending on which flavor of peer review we're talking about, to bring a file in to us for other states to look at. So on analysis, you're bringing in your IPS, you're bringing in your background analysis, your raw, et cetera, and other states will look at that. For exam, you're submitting your exam file in Teammate or Teammate Plus. Same idea, people go through and review that. Now, when I say people go through and review that, I don't mean that it's everyone participating, right? That's still, in my mind, how peer review maybe ought to be, but the time ask of you guys would be insane if we did that. So what we might do is we might say, hey, Oklahoma, you're invited, give us your file, and we're gonna have North and South Dakota and Arkansas take a look at that file for you. And then when you come in person, the 2 Dakotas and Arkansas, we're gonna meet in secret along with an NAIC person. We're not gonna tell you what we're talking about during the day. And then at lunch or at dinner that night, we'll talk about and say, all right, here's what we saw. These things that you're doing, these are awesome. We really wish we could all do that. These other things, we think maybe it would be better, if, for instance, let's say your Exhibit E was not written in crayon. Maybe we actually start typing some of these things down, right? And so we give you some feedback in terms of what we see that's good, what we see that could use some improvement. And the idea is that by doing this, not only are you getting the feedback of, hey, this was good and this could use some feedback, but the people that were sitting in the room now know, oh, I looked at this thing and I didn't like it. I should probably stop doing that myself, right? So we're helping the whole community get better. So I warned you, and here I'm gonna hop down the stairs to begin running around. First question, show of hands, doesn't matter which hand that you guys put up right now. How many of you have taken part in a peer review? So take a look around while people's hands are up. So about a quarter of you. All right, now we're gonna get a little bit more complicated. Using your left hand, all right, yeah, see, more complicated. How many of you in this room are financial analysts? All right, using your right hand, how many of you are financial examiners? About equal split, this is pretty good. All right, now we've used a left hand, we've used a right hand. So now using your right leg, just kidding, both hands. If you are the dreaded examalist, we've got at least one, excellent. And finally, and here's where I get to pick on the non-financial regulators. If you are not a financial analyst, a financial examiner, or the dreaded examalist, if you are a Part D specialist, if you are an NAIC staff member, if you are something else, please go ahead and stand up for a moment. Get your blood flowing and stand up. All right, so all of the rest of you not standing, look around. These are the enemies, so we know where they're at now. All right, so I'm going to be talking primarily at the analysts and the examiners in the room. But some of you are staff and may wonder, Why do we take over the NAIC training room periodically? Some of you might be managers for people. Some of you might be very nervous when I walk towards you with a microphone, wondering if I'm going to give it to you, right, Mario? See, he knows. So I want all of you to know and go through this presentation realizing that none of you are safe. At any point in time, I could stop and hand you the microphone and ask you a question. That'll help keep you guys awake. All right. So we're going to start off talking about analysis peer review. What are some of these best practices we've developed over this last year or so? And there's going to be a handful of them here. So first up, and here I'm going to have to cheat and look backwards, when we're talking about branded risks, so I'm assuming the vast majority of you have seen an IPS before because the examiners see it to generate the SRMs, et cetera. If you have an overall assessment of your branded risk, that really should be summarizing what you just said, right? That makes sense if we're saying it's an overall assessment. But as you're doing that, we want you to consider two things. One, not all risks need to be weighted equally, right? You may have a significant risk in there, and you may say, you know, that's enough that this whole branded risk category is significant. You may also say, I've got like 7 moderate risks in this one category for this one company. It's doomed. That might be enough for you to say it's significant, right? It's up to you to do that overall weighting. But if you're having this overall narrative, explain it. Give us a sentence telling us how you arrived there. Why are you doing that? Well, one, it's going to help you next year, right? You're going to come back to this analysis at the next year, and you're going to look at it and go, wait, why did I think this was a significant risk? Or why did I think this was only a minimal risk? But more importantly, when there is a shuffle in your department and somebody else takes over the file, you're going to understand what was going on. So again, show of hands, how many of you have had to take over an analysis file from someone else? All right, so again, if people would look around, right, you see the number of hands going up, it's a fact of life, right? This is one of those things that happens. The other thing we would like you to do in here is if there are mitigating circumstances, go ahead and tell us about them, right? Because this is the right place to tell us about the positives, right? Anywhere within this branded risk narrative, tell us about a positive. It shouldn't be down in the risk table, right? Because a mitigating factor or positive, that's not a risk. That's something useful. And if you do have a branded risk category with 5 or 6 risks, it's really useful to have this just sort of overall assessment at the end. Even if it's only one sentence long, just to say, this is why I think it's this, right? So far, so good. Everyone with me? All right. Let's go to the next lesson, right? Like Shakespeare said, what's in a name? That which we call a rose would be as sweet by any other name. But when we're talking about risks, risk names are really important. So here, could I get a volunteer from somewhere near me? I'm picking on you. You raised your hand at the wrong moment. I know, it's terrible, isn't it? I told you, anyone was at risk. So I'm going to hand this to you in a moment. But if you look at an IPS, and there is a risk named bonds, what does that risk tell you? What is that risk?
Okay, so I'm going to be thinking about perhaps market risks in the branded risk category of, I might be thinking that, you know, the current interest rate environment, there may be some potential fluctuation for the market value of those bonds.
So a variety of options, right? You could have interest rate risk, you could have, maybe everything they own is actually NAIC 6. It'd be a strange company, but stranger things have happened. Maybe the company has talked to you about selling all of their bonds so that they could buy more crypto assets. Because, again, companies make strange decisions sometimes, right? So that risk name of bonds that's not enough for me to understand that the risk is really that 60% of their bonds are in privately placed assets, or that they have a concentration within the financial sector in their bonds, right? So I like to give credit where credit is due. That was an IPS that came through peer review a couple of years ago from Connecticut, to again, give the credit, that somebody did a really good job catching that the vast majority of the bonds on this company were concentrated in large banks, right? That's not something easy to notice, but if you called the risk bonds, that's lost. So I would like you guys to be careful in how you choose your names. Examiners, I don't want you feeling left out. We're going to pick on you for the same thing, right? Because names matter, right? They should reflect what the risk actually is. Similarly, if I tell you that the only risk listed in a particular branded risk category is increasing combined ratio, how many of you think that this is a company that has an increase in combined ratio happening? Okay, at least one person was honest and believed what they wrote, right? But we've seen this time and time again, where a risk with a name like increasing combined ratio, you see, oh yeah, they've had 4 years of a combined ratio of 95. And this year it went to 94. But we're concerned that in the future, that could go up above 100, and that could be a problem. Right? So that becomes a little bit of a misleading risk name, because if you're taking that IPS and you're handing it off to your chief, or worse, you're handing it off to your commissioner because that company is down in the lobby with a question, right? They're going to glance through really quickly, and they're not going to know what's happening there. So we want to be careful with that and make sure that our names reflect reality. The other thing that we see a lot of is we get actual significant risks. So things that you as the analyst have assessed as significant, and there is nothing talking about how you are going to monitor that risk, right? Even if you do have it later on, somewhere under like your plans going forward, if you have some significant risk, we're talking about something that we're viewing as potentially an existential crisis for this company, I'd like to know, as I'm looking at it, what it is you're doing about it. I'd also like to know what it is the company is doing about it, really. But this is about what you could potentially be doing about it. So be very clear about how you are going to monitor this risk. Now, watch carefully as I talk out of both sides of my mouth now, all right? With other risks, we would like you to at least have these same thoughts and maybe consider doing this as well. But we also want you to be compact and remember that the S in the IPS is summary, right? So with the moderate risks, let's face it, with only 3 steps, there's going to be gradations of moderate. If it's a scary kind of moderate risk, think about doing the same thing. If your IPS is only 4 or 5 pages long, think about doing the same thing. If your IPS is 27 pages long, please don't, right? So there's a little bit of a balance in here. So go ahead and tell me specific things that you are going to do. What kind of metric are you going to follow? What sort of ratios are you going to be looking at? What sort of results do you care about going forward? And much later, we'll come back to this idea, but at the same time, think about what the company is doing about this risk, right? Is the risk the company themselves, or is the risk something that the company is aware of and is addressing? Because then you can kind of do what they do. Why do this? Well, one, it kind of presents that info immediately, so we see what's going on. 2, this is where it starts getting more importantly, it shows you understand that company. you know enough about them to know what it is you need to do. Right? If you've got a company that just did an annual filing and their combined ratio is 120, but on the last annual filing was 190, that's actually the right direction, right? You might not be as scared of that 120. So you can tell us, yeah, I'm keeping an eye on it because it's going in the right direction, but I don't have to worry so much about it. Kim, I'm going to pick on you. So if you have a combined ratio company, a company coming in with combined ratio of 120, and we've replaced the analyst with an AI, what are they going to do?
What's the AI going to do?
Yeah. Is the AI going to care that there's a downward trend, or are they just going to go, it's the end of the world?
I mean, I would think it would care, but it would probably depend on historicals as far as other stuff as well.
So you are going to be infinitely more clever than the AI, because it probably will care. But that's a weighted probably there, right? So this is where I'm going to be a tool user and not a tool talk, right? All of you, analysts and examiners, right? We heard this morning about the impact of AI on the industry. That's not just at insurance companies. That's everyone in this room too. So you need to figure out how to be a tool user so you can make use of AI instead of being a tool and being replaced by AI. Right? So when you're doing these things, think about what you bring to this process. Right? What can you tell me about this risk at this company that a program isn't going to know? When you talk to the CEO, did the examiner walk out of the room and go, ooh, I wouldn't trust that guy? Right? That's a factor that you might want to think about. If you happen to notice that there are numbers on their assets page that haven't changed in 5 years. If Rodney was in the room, I would ask if it was assets or statement of income, because this is a real company I'm thinking of. That's one of those things you're going to pick up on, and maybe a program isn't. Right? So make use of these tools as they come around. Don't let them replace you. All right. So that was analysis best practices. Not so many because of, again, timing for things. So I want to talk a little bit about exam. Bruce, you had a question.
So just a question either for Topher or for someone in the audience. So I think clearly this recommendation is really important, that if it is a significant risk, we want to cite, well, what are we going to be paying attention to monitor this risk going forward? Where would you put that in your IPS? Because you've got a supervisory plan section where you can talk about how I'm planning to monitor them going forward. Or you could put it under the individual branded risk where you're talking about that risk or issue. Or you could put it in both places. I'm just wondering what's kind of the best practice there? Does anybody have a recommendation in that regard? Or Topher, your thoughts?
So how many of you put it only in the supervisory plan? Couple hands going up. How many of you put it only in the branded risk? Couple hands. How many of you do both? How many of you have been too lazy to put up your hand? All right, so sounds like there's a, not necessarily an agreement. This is one where honestly, I mean, if it was me based on the files I've seen, I would suggest having at least a summary in the branded risk of here's what I'm doing going forward. See the supervisory plan for more. But having in both isn't necessarily bad. Again, unless you have a 20 some odd page IPS already, then maybe you want to be a little bit more sparse with your wording. So far, so good. All right, let's talk about exam best practices. So one of the things we have seen is the idea that because the board monitors a risk, that risk is fully mitigated. And in some circumstances, sure, I'm willing to bite on that one. I'm willing to go with you on it. But there was also at least one, and this was the inspiration, or at least part of the inspiration in this particular session for this particular best practice, where they were saying that reserving really wasn't an issue because the board was keeping an eye on it. But this was an RRG whose board was composed entirely of surgeons. Surgeons are amazing human beings. They have almost as much ego as I do. But most of them are not also actuaries. Right? So this was one of those cases where maybe the board was not really sufficiently expert to actually act as a control to the level that this particular exam was applying it. Right, so that's one of those things, just think about a little bit about, well, who was on my board and who was looking on this. The other thing that we have seen several times now is that the board gets used as a control. Well, okay, we don't really have to worry about the growth of the company into these other lines in the other states because the board approves it. But if the board only discusses that for 5 or 10 minutes once per year, is that really sufficient to be a strong control? So the other thing is that even if the board has the expertise, I want you to think about how much time the board has to apply that expertise. So does the board actually have enough depth and understanding, and do they have the time to apply that understanding that they do have? Because it really is. In many cases, this is the control we can point at during an exam. But we need to make sure that it is actually as strong a control as we are portraying it. Right? Because, like I said, if your board is all surgeons, don't ask them to be actuaries. They are many things, but they are not usually actuaries. Sometimes they're lawyer doctors, but rarely are they lawyer doctor actuaries. All right, other things we've seen. And this, to some extent, applies to the guidance that I give to the accreditation team members when I'm an observer, which is when you are doing an interview, go ahead and provide the people ahead of time with a list of the general topics, right? You want your CEO or your CFO to understand what sort of questions you're going to ask them. Maybe even tell them a few specific questions that you might need them to research a little bit beforehand. But you don't want to tell them, oh, by the way, here are the 20 verbatim questions I'm going to be asking you, because in some companies, you're not going to be getting the CEO's answer at that point, right? You're going to get the general counsel's answer. It's just the CEO sitting in front of you, puppeting it. So we want to avoid that. So definitely really useful to give people some idea of what kind of topics you might want to ask. But if you tell people, these are all of the specific questions that I want to ask, you may not get the answers that you want. I made a reference to accreditation, right? So one of my other roles is as an observer for the accreditation team. Those guys do a great job of going through and providing questions, particularly for exams, ahead of time. By nature of how accreditation is done, the questions for analysis come during the week when they're on site. And provided Bruce doesn't kill me for asking for them 100 million times, I like to tell them that it is okay to be very broad in your topics, right? As an analyst, you may get something that says, I'd like to talk to you about the market risk for this company. The understanding there is, you know the company, you can figure that out. So, same rules here, right? The CEO, the CFO, the chief risk officer, the general counsel, the chairman of the board, all of them are expected to know this company. So it's okay just to give them sort of general topics. A couple of things that we have also seen are tools that get used. And one of them in particular was corporate governance tools. Right, when we're looking through exams and peer review and we see that corporate governance is rated moderate, I'm going to pick on you here. what do you think of if I say corporate governance is moderate? Does that have meaning to you?
What you're trying to say, if you say it's moderate, which means either the chairman of the board is also the chief executive officer and also owns the company.
Yeah. Yeah. So moderate, there could be all kinds of conflicts hidden in there, right? We don't know what moderate means. So if you're going to use a tool that tells us that you're rating corporate governance as a 5, well, a 5 out of what? If you're giving it a C, well, as a former academic, I'm thinking of that as a passing grade, but really just barely passing. I mean, those are the students that I liked that tried hard, and I really don't want them back in my classroom again, right? So is that the same thing here? Is that they're trying hard on corporate governance and you really don't want to have to look at them again? So you need to give us some context for these, right? Some of that is, again, you're going to have new examiners come in. You're going to have new analysts come in that are going to be looking at these reports. So that's going to help yourselves. But occasionally, files get shared, right? You might be working in a coordinated exam and you were the lead or you took the lead on this. And everyone else is going to go, well, what does it mean if corporate governance got a C, right? Is it out of A through Z? Is it A through F? Does anyone ever give an E? So you just want to be clear about these things. That's going to help you. That's going to help other people out as well. Other things we see on Exhibit CC, right? This is where we want you going through and listing out all of your risks as you're kind of in those early phases of the exam. It is perfectly acceptable to be redundant on Exhibit CC, right? You might have multiple people updating it and they missed that something was in there. As you learn more, you may see, oh, this risk that I listed from the interviews is the same as this risk that the analyst mentioned. It's just different phrasings, but really it's the same risk. That's okay. That's fine. But go ahead and combine those before you move it over into a matrix, right? We don't want to see that we're looking at the investments matrix and there are 6 risks that are effectively identical. They're just slightly different phrases. So take a look at your risks and make sure that before moving them into a KFA, I shouldn't say matrix anymore, or into Exhibit V, that you're going through and combining those. In fact, I've seen some states that just have a nice column in there that say, hey, this is the same as risk whatever below, or this is the same as risk whatever above. Pick the one that really suits the company and your understanding of it the best. And then roll with that one. Because we don't need to go through and test the same risk repeatedly. When you get to the matrix and you're looking at a risk and you realize, oh, I've got 4 risks, all of which kind of sound the same, all of which have the same control or controls, that might be a sign that maybe you've done this. So that's one of those things to think about and kind of keep an eye on and look for as you're moving forward. This will help with efficiency as you're going through with these as well. So I mentioned on analysis that, what's in a name, that, we want good risk names that apply, risk names that are specific. The same thing can also pop up in exams, right? We sometimes see risk names really being pulled directly out of an ORSA or directly out of a 10K filing. And those risks, especially when they're coming out of the 10K, even when they're coming out of the ORSA, can be crazy, crazy broad, right? You might have a risk of competition. You might have a risk of the economy, right? So what does that mean, right? So we want you to start narrowing that down and thinking about what is the risk, right? Because generally speaking, especially on public filings like a 10K, companies aren't really motivated to say, these are the things that we think are going to kill us. But what they're telling you as a risk in there is usually going to be accurate, at least to some extent. So it's worth looking at and thinking about it. If it's coming out of an ORSA, if it's coming out of an ERM, this is how the company is thinking about their risk. But that's not necessarily how we as financial examiners, financial analysts think about risks. So really here, start aiming more, and this applies equally to analysts. Aim for kind of atomic risks, right? If we have a risk called bonds, right, going back to that earlier example, and we look through it, and it turns out that really 40% of their bonds are privately placed, and we're concerned about that high of a percentage. And also 30% of their bonds, somewhat overlapping, are NAIC 6 bonds, and also somewhat overlapping, 25% of their bonds are with companies that are in danger of declaring bankruptcy in the next year and have going concern issues, right? That one risk called bonds is just too broad, right? We're seeing multiple risks embedded within there. And this, again, right, because I talked to the analyst a little bit about AI, this is one of those cases where you as the human get to be the tool user rather than the tool. Because this is still very much an art and not a science. Here I say aim for atomic risks and atomic controls. Atomic meaning down to as simple as you can make them. But the key part of that phrase there is as you can make them. You don't want to go any more simple than it needs to be. Some things are complex, right? But, excuse me, I don't want to see risks that are, well, you know, the risk is that the company may invest poorly, or they may not invest enough, or they may choose to invest in assets that we don't approve of, or their investment manager may not follow their risk policy, or their investment policy manager might embezzle, right? Yeah, all of those things are risks. And then if you have the single control of, well, the board monitors, that's getting at sort of the worst of all of these universes. So you want to simplify things down to the extent that you can, but no further. Excuse me. All right, so with external work, we really like you guys using external work and leveraging it. That saves you time, that's making use of work that's already been done. So really helps a lot. If you're gonna do that, we want you to go through and kind of keep focused on what it is you're using and why it is you're using it. What is it that you need to use to go through to ID those risks and kind of scope out what you're doing? Right, so I don't want you to wholesale accept work papers from an accountant because you want to use them, you know, in one part and then import all of those into the project, right? So keep in mind what it is you're looking for and how it is you're going to use them. So what do you need to use to ID the risk and to scope in the activity? Why are you using those particular work papers for that particular issue? So if their objectives align with yours, this is great. If their objectives don't align with yours, you can still make use of them. You just have to be a little bit more clever about what it is you're doing, right? And think about, well, they really wanted to do this, they did that. Sampling wise, they sampled 20 things. For what I'm adding, you know, looking at what I need, I probably need 30 samples. The right answer at that point is to go ahead and find 10 more samples, right? Get to where you need to be. The wrong answer is to resample those 20 so that you get to 30. Or to say, 20 is close enough, I can stop there. Or to say, well, you know, we've got 20, so I'm going to use 10 of them for accuracy and I'm going to use 10 of them for completeness. And I'm not going to worry about that third 10. Right, so want to think about why you're using the papers. And finally, if you see a problem, stop. right? Don't keep relying on that work paper if there is a problem. Take a look to see how pervasive is that particular issue. If the issue is only that one work paper, not a problem, right? You just kind of work around that one. If you discover a fundamental flaw in what they're doing, you know, they told you that they sampled 100 things and they actually sampled 10, and every time they talked about sampling, they over-reported by 10x, you just stop relying on them at that point, right? And it is okay to go back and to leave a note explaining why you are no longer relying on these work papers. But what we don't want to see, and what we have seen, is that when there is a problem discovered, sometimes people just keep moving forward. And we can't do that, right? If we know that the data is bad, don't rely on it. And again, kind of going back to one of my themes here, you want to be a tool user, not a tool. If you know that the data is bad, but you keep moving forward, that's the same thing that a computer program would do. So you've gone through, you have an issue, you talk to the company, they send back a response to you. But that response involves throwing around triple integrals and a bunch of statistics. How many of you are happy looking at triple integrals? A couple of you, good. So a few of you are willing to tell the truth. I appreciate that, nerds. So if you get a response back from the company that is highly technical in an area where you are not comfortable, and you don't have another staff member handy that is comfortable in that area, chances are you're already using a specialist, right? You're using an actuary to look through these things. If they have complex investments, you're using an investment specialist to look through it. You've got an IT person looking through their computer systems. Yeah, somebody pointed at Kim just now, I agree. So if the response comes back, oh, well, we're not actually using the 7-layer TCP IP stack, we're actually using this one that we home grew over coax. Even I don't know what that means at this point, and the words came out of my mouth. So that's when you want to find a specialist to come in and help you evaluate that response, to go, oh yeah, that's reasonable. Because, you know, I try not to be cynical. I aim for professional skepticism instead. But sometimes companies lie. So sometimes we need to actually verify their answers. So if they come back with you as a response, the fact that they responded alone is not sufficient. If you don't understand the response, find someone that can read through it for you. All right. How many of you in here are exam supervisors or EICs? A couple of you. So this is the part where I get to be mean. Say, avoid power ticking, right? As you go through and do your supervisory reviews, do not try to go checking off whole categories at a time. Don't select everything in that same folder all at once. I know with Teammate Plus, there's still a few issues in terms of, as you're reviewing work papers, how do you go through? When do you mark things? Does it work? Does it not work? Did it crash on you? Did it not save things? I acknowledge all of those issues. What we don't want you to do is to go through and just say, oh, well, here, let me just open phase 3. I trust them. Here, I've signed off on phase 3 testing for everything. Go ahead and look through the work papers, right? So don't power tick. The other thing that we see, and I don't know if David Vaca is in the room at the moment, is sometimes supervisors, as they're going back and forth, they come across problems and they go, I'm just fixing this myself. Whatever the deadline is that we're coming up to, it's in 4 hours, I just want this done. David Vaca is very good at finding cases of this. So if you have gone through and you have made any sort of major change, you need to either send that back to the original person for the work paper, or have a secondary reviewer sign off on it. Right? If you are correcting a typo. David, do you care about if they correct a typo? Yeah, I don't care if they correct a typo. That's okay. If you have rewritten the description of the test, right, that's a major change. Somewhere in between there, there's a gray area where each of you will have to reflect on your ethics training to decide where it is. But if you're making a major change, you can't sign off on the change you just made, right? So send it back to the original author or have a second supervisor look through it. So far, so good? So those were the best practices updated from what we had told you last year. There are still a few more things that we need to talk about, though. So these are things that are not necessarily best practices, but they're other update type things that have changed. We're going to mix a little bit of exam and analysis and maybe other things all together through in here. So the first one, this is very much exam, which is that we made changes in the directions for Exhibit A, right? And this was based on feedback from multiple peer reviews of how people actually use this exhibit, right? So in this case, we combined the meeting with the analyst and the meeting with other personnel because it seems like every department we talk to just says, oh yeah, we have an initial kickoff meeting internally and we don't really have a separate meeting with the analyst. We also combined the IT sub-steps together into a single step because that's not really something the EICs are usually doing. That's more your IT examiner doing things. And then finally, there was step 5, which was telling the EIC to go through and update the IPS. Analysts in the room, how many of you would become downright feral if an examiner started updating your IPS before the exam had even occurred? Couple of hands going up. All right, so better be safe, right? You might actually get paired up with that analyst. So in this case, we just said, yeah, no, that's really the analyst's job at that stage. So those are some changes we made for Exhibit A. Across multiple peer reviews, across accreditation pre-reviews, across feedback we've heard from the accreditation team, SRMs have almost become bimodal, right? We see SRMs that are pretty good, and we see SRMs that are just bad. And so we tried to combine all of these kind of things we were seeing to say, okay, well, we need to update these best practices. And so, Elise Kleba, the maven of the Financial Condition Examiner's Handbook, sat down, kind of put all of these together and realized that every single one of these best practices we had pulled together based on what people were doing wrong was already in the handbook. So this is my public service announcement of, hey, some of you have been examiners for a really long time. And some of you kind of keep an eye on the updates, but it might be worth going back and giving a quick reread to parts of it as well. So in this case, we really considered new best practices here, but all of them, literally every single one we had thought of, was already in either the handbook or as an existing exam best practice. So this is a case of, doesn't anyone listen to us? So that's why I'm pacing around the room, making you guys all nervous. You never know who I'm going to hand a microphone off to next, right? Because now you're paying attention. It's like a feral monkey wandering around with a banana. No telling where that thing is going. All right. So this is aimed far more at all of you. There is definitely a fear of foolishness, right? It's scary to feel foolish. But for those of you who have, some amount of gray hair, some lack of hair like me, right? You might all recognize Peter Falk up there as Columbo, who was always good of just one more question. Can you explain this to me? Just one more thing, right? He always came across as a little foolish and a little dumb and a little naive, but he wasn't, right? He was very clever. he was able to get people to tell him things because they treated him like a moron. So there is power in appearing to be foolish. And some of you are probably going, well, yeah, but I don't just appear foolish. I am foolish. I really do know nothing about cybersecurity. And this is where I would like to once again remind you all of the sentinel effect. So the sentinel effect says that if people think they are being watched, they are being monitored, they are being regulated, they behave better, right? There is this beautiful natural experiment that got run in the 80s out of, I think it was the OCC when they moved a branch office out of Arkansas to Texas. I think that's correct. And we saw that the banks started misbehaving greatly when all of a sudden they went from having many bank examiners to 2. But there's plenty of other research that also backs this up, right? This was why, as a professor, when I gave an exam, there would always be a giant smiley face up on the screen where my slides are now. Because even that is enough to get people to feel like they're being watched. And that is enough to get them to behave more honestly. So even if you don't think you will understand the answer, there is still value in asking that question, right? Just by forcing them to put together that answer. And at worst, you can go through and you can check with someone else to go, did that actually make any sense? And if it didn't, that tells you something about the character of the insurer. And if it did, you've learned something. Don't be afraid to ask them to clarify and explain things. Tell me like I'm 5. How does this work? How is it that you putting all of your assets into Bitcoin is going to somehow make these liabilities go away? Right? Explain that one again. One word, small words, less than 2 syllables. Right? There's value in that. Right? So as I said, this is the sentinel effect, even when you don't know it. So go ahead and embrace that feeling of foolishness. It's okay. If you don't think that I am not terrified as I pace around this room, you were wrong, right? There is value in feeling foolish. All right, this one's a little bit more aimed at the analysts, but it does apply, I think, to the examiners, which is anytime you're thinking about a risk, especially on the IPS, but also when you're going to update the SRM. When you're looking at a risk, tell me what the specific risk is. What will happen if the worst case happens with this risk? Right? So those are 2 separate things. They could all be in one sentence together. Right? So the risk is that they have these terrible bonds, and if all of them happen to belong to companies that go bankrupt, their assets are reduced by this much, and they're not going to be able to pay out their liabilities. Okay? What is the company doing about that risk? Sometimes the answer is going to be nothing. The company might not even see it as a risk. They see no problem in them trying to sweet talk you into letting them hold crypto assets. Maybe I shouldn't pick on crypto quite so much anymore, but it's still fun. And then finally, most importantly, right, this gets back to what I was talking about with significant risk, but how it can apply to other things, is how will you as the department monitor that risk and how the company responds to it, right? If you can tell me these 4 things about a risk, you've given me a very complete picture of what's going on. For coaching notes, again, both analysis and exam, coaching notes need to be followed up on, right? In a couple of cases recently, we've seen coaching notes on an annual analysis where there was a comment to the effect of, oh, well, we'll get to this on the next annual analysis. But it was about things that would impact the analysis for this year. Or we've seen coaching notes on exams where it was the, we've already written the SRM and the report, so we'll leave a note for the next exam to go through and take a look at that. So you want to make sure that coaching notes are being followed. So supervisors, you do need to ensure that there is follow-up on your coaching notes, right? You want to make sure that your precious advice is being used well. Teammate Plus, as I'm running out of time here, is there anyone in here that is in a department that uses Teammate Plus that hasn't used it themselves yet? Okay, nobody put up their hand on that one. Some of you are not using it yet. I see you, Mr. Hagan. So I would like all of you in here, and poke at your colleagues about this too. Think about what worked and what didn't work, right? Because how many of you would like to see best practices on Teammate Plus or hints and tricks for Teammate Plus come from NAIC? I see only a handful of hands. How many of you have emailed us about it already though, right? We don't use it. You guys use it. So we really need you guys to tell us what works. So tell us what's happening, what works. If you have things that your department has always done, this might be a good time to maybe reevaluate. Were these things good things to be doing? Because now we're using a new tool. This is, we can clean house in the new tool. So as concluding thoughts, we have a couple of upcoming peer reviews. I will be telling people in the next day or two about this November one who's been accepted. After that, we're going to have an IT peer review. It'll be our first IT one. Next year, we're going to do an analysis one and an exam one. We're talking about an ORSA one. If any of you have specific things you would like to see out of an ORSA peer review, please let me or Bruce Jensen know, because we're kind of debating what that would necessarily involve or what would be in it. All right. And there's a couple places you can go to find more, right? Some of the stuff older up in StateNet, but primarily we're going to NAIC Connect. NAIC Connect has terrifying URLs, lots of hex, but it's there. So these are both under the financial regulator resources if you're looking for them. And I would like to thank each and every one of you for bearing with me as I went over time by like a minute and a half here. So thank you.